Well, the Alex Murdaugh trial continues, and it has been very rocky today. Already we've lost 2 jurors to a COVID infection. The clerk of court, who is an awesome lady, out with COVID. But the evidence continues to stream from the witness stand. Now, the judge did something really smart. He got, I believe it was 6 alternates. Now, in some jurisdictions, that may be considered too many alternates. I think it's perfect because we're already using 2 of them. Now, there's some word that the state is going to rest its case this week. If we can just get that jury through, say, another week or so of the defense's case, then we'll be into closing arguments and deliberations, hopefully without losing any more jurors. But let's talk about the evidence. I know that's what you want to hear about. With me, high-profile defense lawyer out of Jacksonville, Dale Carson. The reason I love him is because he's a former FBI agent. You can find him at dalecarsonlaw.com. And then the director at the Cold Case Foundation, former homicide detective. I found him looking for Kohberger information during the Idaho search for the killer in the student's death on YouTube in the interview room. You can find him at coldcasefoundation.org. Gentlemen, let's just get down and dirty. Let's start with the blood evidence. The blood evidence that we're hearing about today, the steering wheel on Alex Murdaugh's Chevy Suburban, which he drove the night that his wife and son were murdered, has blood on it, tested positive for blood, according to a SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division agent specializing in DNA analysis. Her name, Rachel Nguyen. Let's talk about that. 3 things I want to talk about, if you can, gentlemen. 1, the blood. 2, the precise location where Curtis Edward Smith, a.k.a. Cousin Eddie, shot Murdaugh. And 3, the rounds found at the crime scene and throughout Moselle, the hunting lodge. If we can get to all 3 of those, that will be a miracle. So let's kick it off with the blood. First to you, Dale Carson, what do you make of blood being on the steering wheel of the Chevy Suburban? Listen, I went to a Chevy lot this weekend and got into one of these Suburbans. It's like it's a houseboat. It's huge. It goes way, way back. They're ginormous. They're huge. And I'm wondering, and I did it just because I wanted to see what Alex Murdaugh was driving. But the steering wheel is a perfect place for retaining blood DNA. And, I know the state couldn't be happier. And I guarantee you, it's going to be either Maggie's or Paul's or a mixture of Maggie's, Paul's, and Murdaugh's, or else the state wouldn't have brought it in. Go ahead, Dale.
This is all credible evidence to demonstrate his path of travel. Was he where he said he was when he was there? And if there's a mixture of the blood DNA analysis, then that indicates one thing. If it was only his blood, that indicates something else. But another favorite place to look is the key fob. And it's interesting to know whether or not they took that from him in the course of their investigation. And I haven't seen any evidence connected with that, so kind of doubt that happened. But another one is the seat adjustments. There are many other places to find that DNA from blood residue in an automobile.
Okay, you know what? That was all just... Have you ever watched the Charlie Brown series? Because you just sounded like the teacher. Wah, 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 wah. Because, listen, talk and regular people talk.
Sure, all right, well...
Why else would Maggie and or Paul's blood be on his steering wheel? How is he going to explain that away? I mean, is there some way he's going to say, I touched the bodies and I went back in my car and I beat my head against the steering wheel? What? Who's that? Is that Chris?
He says that he checked for a pulse on his kid who didn't have a head left and he could have gone back to his car to get on the cell phone. So there are any number of ways, but the question is, what did he tell the investigators, and does it conflict with what he told the investigators? Because that's where you can kill his credibility.
What about it, Chris McDonough?
So Nancy, there's a couple things going on here, right? Number one, if I think people have to understand, if you're using a shotgun, then that creates a blast, which creates an impact, and then that impact moves blood and other potential evidence either forward or backwards. And a shotgun is known to go in all directions. So there's a couple possibilities. Number one, if that he was in the proximity of that shotgun blast, then blood could have potentially transferred onto him, and then when he got into a vehicle, that would have transferred into the vehicle.
Oh, stop. What are you trying to tell me? He sat on the steering wheel?
No.
He didn't have to have blood on his hands to get it on the steering wheel.
Oh, right. He could have had it on his hands, but he could also have had it on, sometimes, clothing, as you're getting in and out of a vehicle when you're touching the steering wheel.
When I get in and out of the vehicle, any vehicle, my chest and tummy so far don't touch the steering wheel. No, Chris McDonough, I don't like disagreeing with you because you can run circles around me when it comes to certain matters, but if he shot the gun, okay, let's pretend he didn't shoot the gun.
Right.
How would he have gotten, what's his excuse for getting blood on the steering wheel? You're saying because he tried to turn them over or check their pulse?
That's what he said.
Yes, and let's remember, he introduced that narrative. All right?
Yes, he did.
So he introduces the narrative that he touches Paul, for sure. And then in that car interview, he said he went towards Maggie, but then he kind of backed away from that for a second, went back towards Paul, and that's where he introduced.
But here's the tricky part. Does he say he went back to the car after that? I don't remember him saying he went back to the car.
But you can hear a car in the background on that first 911 call.
Okay, that's a good point.
So I think that's where the prosecution's going here.
Yeah.
They're going to try to connect him to that car through that call.
Here's another.
But the falsity of his testimony is in the very outset. I have never seen anyone go to a body that has been shot with a shotgun in the head to check for a pulse. I mean, why would you even think to do that? So that narrative, that statement given to law enforcement, from my perspective, is not credible. Now, whether the jury sees that or not is another matter entirely. And you may have to add to it to demonstrate conclusively to the jury panel that he is not being credible. And you do that with a discontinuity between the interview and the information he provided with that blood evidence, because it's either true or false that he went back to the car, and depending on whose blood is on that steering wheel will tell us a great deal.
Guys, previous witnesses have testified under oath that Murdaugh's hands and clothing were both clean the night of the murder, despite an incredibly bloody crime scene. So he did not have blood on his hands or his clothing when the cops got there. And remember, they put him in a vehicle and were talking to him. And we can see his hands. And he's touching his face. He does not have any blood on him. But I want to find out exactly what he says. I don't recall him saying he went and sat in his car. But that said, it's much better for the state that there is blood on the steering wheel than if there was not blood on the steering wheel. Do you agree with me on that, at least?
Yeah, I agree with you, because it shows that he went into the car, and that means he was present at the scene. Those were all, the defense hasn't acknowledged anything at this juncture. They haven't presented their side of the case. So the more tied down the evidence is by the state, the more effective they are against any kind of testimony coming from the defense angle.
You know what's a big mistake? And I don't know if the state's going to do this or not, but it's a big mistake to try to explain DNA to a jury. It's hard enough for scientists to really understand it, for lawyers to understand it, and to articulate it appropriately. But it reminds me of the first time I ever used a DNA analysis in court. I insisted that the scientists bring all of their photographs and slides and everything from the crime lab. And the woman put them up, and I took one look at them. You know what it looks like? If it's not under a microscope, it looks like film that you pull out of a camera that didn't quite have time to develop. It was just a bunch of dots. Well, I can tell you, I got that down as quickly as I could get it down. And I guess the defense, I guess they assumed I understood it because they didn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Thank heaven. Because if I had asked a jury to believe in that blobby mess up on the poster, oh, that was a huge error on my part. Never did that again. So we're talking about the blood on the steering wheel of Alex Murdaugh's car, his Suburban, the night of the murders. But also, let's talk about the shooting, where Curtis Edward Smith, a.k.a. Cousin Eddie, shot Alex Murdaugh. Now, Dale Carson, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but Chris McDonough has it laid out beautifully. And where can we see that, Chris McDonough? Where can the listeners and viewers actually see it in full?
They can go to the interview room.
Right.
I have it up there.
Really, really great job. And that's how I first found Chris, was because he did a drive-through through Moscow, Idaho, before I could get there, and it was so perfectly done. Okay, tell me what you learned, Chris McDonough. We're talking about the Curtis Edward Smith shooting, the arranged shooting of Alex Murdaugh. Go ahead.
Wow, Nancy. So 9.2 miles away from the house, actually from the Murdaugh home, you take all these rural, country back roads, and you come to this one spot that is
okay,
just
wait a minute. 9.2 miles from Moselle, the hunting lodge?
Yes, 9.2
okay.
miles.
And when you say back roads, you mean it. Because, I had supper I had made for the twins and David, and I wanted to have supper with them before I left to go to South Carolina. And I got in the car at about 7-ish. So I was on the road till after midnight. And the back roads, it was a 2-lane. It was pitch dark. The only thing I saw were 40 or 50, not kidding, deer and a lot of possums. Nothing. I mean, it is very sparse and very ill lit. Well, it's not lit at all. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, dark, in the middle of nowhere, not a car for miles. We stood there for 15 minutes, didn't have a single car pass us. And you look at this area and you think to yourself, what in the world was going on here, where all of a sudden you have a tire issue, you're off to the side of the road, and boom, a gunshot goes off, and allegedly you're ambushed. I just, I had a hard time wrapping my mind around that from an investigative side. And I learned that even there was a citizen that had come by, an elderly couple, saw Mr. Murdaugh bleeding. They got weirded out and continued on. And my understanding is they had reported that to the authorities. So that's going to be interesting to hear later on down in the pipeline here during the trial.
So what struck you the most, Chris, when you looked at the spot where Eddie Smith admittedly shot Alex Murdaugh at Murdaugh's request?
What struck me the most, it reminded me of a case we had years ago where a wife and a boyfriend had lured the ex-husband to a geographic region that was very scarce, very similar to this area where this shooting goes down here. And it just struck me like this was the perfect location to kind of stage the perfect type of crime. But even in that case, they were unsuccessful. And this case, the fact that it went down the way that it did, superficial gunshot wound to the head, treatment at the trauma center in Savannah, it just didn't look right. It just didn't look right.
On day one, I said, listen, I know this is a rural road, but it's got to intersect somewhere. Somewhere it hits a highway. And what needs to be done very quickly before it's erased by accident is to go to that intersection and see if there's any type of a camera. And sure enough, there is, I believe, a Baptist church all the way at the end of this rural road where it intersects with another road, and they happen to have a camera. And I'm very anxious to hear what the camera reveals. The fact that an unknown assailant would come along and just shoot Murdaugh in the head and keep going, that stunk on day one, Dale Carson, day one. But Dale, when you look at the video that Chris McDonough has made, you see just how far away it is and how isolated it was. And also, it was not even remotely the easiest way to get from point A to point B, where Murdaugh said he was going. This was not the route to do that.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, you're getting this testimony from two individuals whose credibility is clearly at issue, the shooter and the shootee. And so we don't really know what happened there. I agree that there are confessions, if you will, but we don't really know why they were there. Was it what's being told to the court, or not to the court, but to the investigators, or was it something else entirely? Were they meeting up there for a drug deal?
I think it was something else entirely, Dale, and I'll tell you why. If the plan was that Murdaugh wanted Smith to shoot him in the head for his surviving son, Buster, to get the insurance money,
yep,
Smith would have shot him again. He would have shot him dead. 2 bullets. What is that? 50 cents? Bam, over. But he didn't. I really believe that Murdaugh's true plan was to make it appear as if the killer that killed his wife and son was after him all along, and that he intended to be a homicide victim. But then it all went down the crapper. That's what I think happened.
Well, I think you're probably right. Asking someone to shoot you is a little bit outrageous. And of course, you could accomplish that by shooting yourself, as occasionally happens in cases. So what he was doing was, I agree with you, a way to reflect away from the killings of the others.
Yeah. I'm looking again, Chris McDonough, at you flying down this, I think you're speeding, by the way, this country road. There's no way anybody else is going to come along for a good long while. No way. Did you say you were there for 15 minutes before anybody drove by?
Yes, yes.
And the fact that this was not the shortest route to where he was wanting to go just makes it that more contrived.
Yeah, and one of the other things I haven't been able to confirm yet, Nancy, is I wanted to know, is that near the edge of his property? That property out there, because that's a big hunting area. So I didn't know what the correlation was to why he would have, come up that back road like that, unless there's a back entrance into his hunting area.
You just passed that church I was talking about. Guys, another thing I wanted us to talk about were the rounds found on the property there at the hunting lodge, Moselle. What about that, Dale Carson?
Well, at a minimum, they found other rounds there. And if you know about ballistics, which you do, there are often firing pin marks, and those firing pin marks on the back of the bullet at the primer can be connected to other weapons, and they can be found to be identical to other firearms. So you can trace those expended rounds that were left at the scene to other rounds that had been found on the property.
They
and
did
would
that.
Tend to indicate, they did. And that would tend to indicate that the rifles used, the shotgun used, I know the rifle for certain. I'm not entirely clear about the shotgun, but the rifle certainly was one of the rifles that lived at the estate. So the question arises, how the hell did anybody get a hold of that without being a member of the hunting club, part of the family, or an owner of those firearms?
Guys, think about this. The likelihood that Murdaugh leaves at 8:49, 8:50, that he leaves the location. Actually, I think he was still there texting, hey, I'm leaving to go check on my mom at 9:06. Or was that when he made the 911 call? Let me get out.
No, that's correct.
Let me get out my trial notebook. Yeah. And then he gets back and, around 10 o'clock. And in that time, someone has snuck onto the property, unseen by anyone, goes in the home, gets guns out, shoots them, and takes off with the gun. And then, lo and behold, I guess just as they were leaving, Murdaugh pulls in. And that, 45-minute window? And takes the guns with them? I mean, how? That's so unlikely. It's so improbable.
Well, and
Yeah,
certainly they can look at the actual vehicle to determine whether or not it was, and they have, turned on and off, what the transit times were. Those kind of things become hypercritical in a circumstance like that.
You know what? Speaking of that, we heard from the expert on the stand describing how they could tell when the car doors opened, when the car was put into park and out of park and in park and out of park. And none of that jived with his story that he got back, got out of the car, went and saw them dead, and called 911. It did not jive with what he said. So as you see the case as it stands right now, I believe we're inching toward the end of the state's case. What do you make of it so far, Chris McDonough?
Well, I think the state has done a good job, Nancy. I mean, you've tried hundreds of these situations where I think they've done a good job laying the foundation of the buildup here. And I think over the next couple of days, they're gonna end with their strongest evidence. What that is at this point, I don't know, but I do believe that his timeline, they've done a great job, moving that timeline around correctly and appropriately with, introducing the forensics evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're into the DNA that's going to tie him, hopefully, to those victims, as well as his DNA or their DNA in the car, like we're hearing today, or the Suburban. So I think they've done a good job. I really do.
I think they have, and they are working up to a finale. And let me just say, it darn well better be big. I mean, a confession to Cousin Eddie. They better end with a bang. Do you agree, Dale Carson? I mean, you know how to try a case. You've got Chris McDonough,
Well, I do.
homicide detective. Dale Carson has tried many a murder case. You have to end on a high note. You cannot go out with a whimper.
Well, we have a precursor of what the end is going to be. And it's got to be something that aggregates all of this information together that they've been pouring into the jury panel's minds for the last 2 weeks. And I'm certain that if they are tactically as excellent as they appear to be, they're going to do precisely that. And then it's up to the defense to defeat those positions that are presented by the state. And of course, one of the things that struck me is that they never brought dogs out to search the property, which that's, something you would routinely do if someone had said somebody came onto my property and killed some people. That'd be one of the first things that you do. That never happened. And of course, the defense is going to make a lot out of something like that.
Well, we wait to see how they will culminate the case. We're going straight back in the courtroom. Dale, Chris, thank you for being with us.